I'll be reading from the top 10 rules for playing or running a sword and sorcery game, as well as a brief description of what a sword and sorcery hero is. I found this off the Tabletop RPG Ideas Factory group, and I'll be posting it here in the group for you guys to share if you want to. I usually do these read out versions of the posts because it's sometimes easier for people who have visual impairments or something like that to have it, and that way we have a additional resource for individuals with certain disabilities who want to do it. Or sometimes it's easier than going through an entire paragraph of information when you just don't have the time, and you maybe just want to listen to it on the side while you're doing something else. So this is what I do these things for, and if you like the benefit of this, I'll keep doing them. And if you have things you want me to read out, maybe to your players and stuff, I don't mind that. I've done voice acting work before. I don't mind doing it for you guys too. Alright, so here we go. A sword and sorcery hero is someone who is A. using decisive action to B. pursue self-motivated goals, while C. setting outside the normal rules and conventions of society. And pretty much everything else about the genre follows from that. Sword and sorcery is ultimately the fantasy subgenre of pulp, and the defining trait of pulp is that it's always larger than life. Perhaps the best description comes from Robert Howard. Who else? In the opening of the first Conan story, which, though not the first, was probably the story that launched the genre to become what it is now. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian. Black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his saddled feet. This is the ultimate definition of sword and sorcery. Go big or go home, time to nut up or shut up. Rule number 1. Sword and sorcery stories are self-contained. This is primarily a byproduct of the way pulp stories were published. The tales of a particular hero might be spread out amongst any number of magazines, anthologies, and novellas. Therefore, it was important to make sure that each story stood on its own, and that stories could be read in any order and still make sense. While continuity between stories was not entirely forbidden, references to other stories had to be explainable in a succinct way that would reveal all the necessary information without sidetracking the current tale or spoiling the other story for someone who hadn't read it yet. Therefore, while recurring characters, settings, and themes did show up in pulp fantasy, and some even changed from time to time, the details of prior experience with those recurring elements rarely comes into play. Rule number 2. Sword and sorcery heroes start out extremely competent. In most fantasy games, the heroes start out strong when measuring against normal humans, but relatively weak and inexperienced compared to other heroes. Not so in pulp fantasy stories. The heroes start out as larger-than-life, heroic figures and either stay that way or become even more competent. This is again in part due to the not necessarily sequential format in which the stories were published, which made it hard to do the hero's journey thing. Therefore, the protagonists start out as big damn action heroes, with more in common with Rambo than Luke Skywalker. Rambo starts out very competent, and he even gets more competent as the movies go on. Luke Skywalker starts out not really knowing that much of the Force, and then grows through the hero's journey. Rule number 3. Sword and sorcery heroes are multi-talented. While pulp heroes generally had a core ability that were most commonly used, the hero's skill set expanded to match the needs of the story. For example, though he started out as a barbarian, Conan at various times also played the role of thief, king, pirate, and probably a few more I haven't even read about yet. While a character's new abilities are sometimes explained in other stories, they could just as easily be explained with a reference to an adventure or a situation that hadn't been written about yet. Rule number 4. Everybody knows how to fight. Sword and sorcery settings are violent, brutal places. Also, killing things is exciting. Therefore, everybody knows how to use at least one weapon unless they've got a weakness, such as vow pacifism, that expressly forbids them from fighting. Number 5. Sword and sorcery heroes are not necessarily good people. While most sword and sorcery characters do have at least some sort of moral code by which they live, most would be considered criminals and murderers by today's standards. And many are morally ambiguous, even according to the less civilized standards of the world they live in. Conan may always keep his word, but he also kills and steals without remorse. Number 6. Don't check for traps. Sword and sorcery heroes are about action. While this doesn't mean they're incapable of planning how to get around known obstacles, it does mean that they don't skulk around jumping at shadows or waste valuable time planning for every eventuality. Once an adventure is underway, real adventurers keep moving, reacting to and usually killing whatever comes their way. They don't stand around listening at doors trying to figure out what's behind it. They bash down the door with axes at the ready. Number 7. World build as you go. Pulp authors didn't have a 1,000-page trilogy or half a dozen supplemental books to explain every facet of their world their characters inhabited. Instead, they had to convey the information that was relevant to the story, and rely on sparse but telling details to get across the flavor of background elements that were not pertinent to the story at hand. This economy of storytelling gives readers a single strong impression of the subject, instead of a bunch of boring details that they'll most likely forget anyway. The lack of detail also meant that people and places that were strange and mysterious to the heroes remained strange and mysterious to the readers. Rule number 8. Don't over-explain things. Most characters in sword and sorcery fiction are members of pre-scientific cultures, which means they don't need plausible scientific explanations or even Tim Moore/Alan Moore style good magical thinking for everything the characters encounter. Superstition and speculation are perfectly acceptable. If a tower is said to rise from the sea on the night of the harvest moon, you don't need to explain it with technology or an elaborate backstory about the magician who cursed it. The tower rises from the sea on that night because that's what it does. Magic is a mysterious force, even to those who know how to use it, and the kinds of ancient magic scattered around most fantasy worlds are completely alien to even modern wizards. On a similar note, monsters are monsters, not members of a race or species. Even if there are more than one of them, nobody's ever conducted ecological studies on them. Monsters exist to be killed, not understood. DMing suggestion. Keep your plot simple and only fill in details if they become relevant. Magic should be presented as the harnessing of incomprehensible powers far beyond man's control, not a sphere of knowledge to be mastered. And the magic system should be as free-form, savage, and probably a bit disturbing. Try to avoid giving monsters species names. They should either be mythic creatures of legend, possibly even gods, or just unnamed creatures. If you can't come up with a good monster, it's hard to go wrong with a big-ass snake, an evolved ape-man, or a living statue. Rule number 9. Make the climax exciting. In many role-playing games, the end of the adventure comes when the PCs beat the boss monster at the end of the adventure. While such fight scenes can indeed be exciting, pulp stories tend to take things to the next level. Sword and sorcery villains don't just fight the bad guy. Villains? A typo. I'll read again. Sword and sorcery heroes don't just fight the bad guy. They fight the bad guy on a high precipice during a lightning storm while he's trying to complete a ritual that will bring the end of life as we know it. The final scene of pulp story should be part epic battle, part daring escape, and part disaster movie. DMing suggestion. Include everything that you can think of to make the scene as chaotic as possible, and then add something else. Rule number 10. Easy come, easy go. During their adventures, sword and sorcery heroes often gain enormous amounts of treasure, but unlike characters in most fantasy games, they rarely hold on to them for long. Because pulp heroes are lusty types who live life to the fullest, many treasures will be pissed away on wine, pleasure or song, or lost in games of chance or contests of skill. Even if the heroes don't spend all their loot on debauchery, there are plenty of unscrupulous, conniving, and opportunistic creatures and characters who will separate them from it. DMing suggestion. Give the players a chance at the end of the adventure to explain how they squander away everything they've gained. If they fail to do so, come up with a way for somebody to take it from them. To allow them to keep their hard-won loot would be a betrayal of narrative trust.